Okay, I think we're going to start now. I'd like to introduce Dr. David Kleiner. He received his PhD in chemistry and his MD 2 years later, both from University of Chicago. He is currently a senior research physician at the National Cancer Institute Center for Cancer Research. He is head of the departments of histopathology and autopsy pathology. He's also an adjunct professor here at the Department of Epidemiology here at the School of Public Health. He currently participates in a National Institute of Diabetes and Digestive and Kidney Disease, NIDDK, sponsored multi-center clinical research network focusing on non-alcoholic steatohepatitis, which is named NASH, also known as NASH, and that's a severe form of fatty liver disease. The coordinating, for those of you who don't know, the coordinating center for this clinical research network is housed right here at Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. So since 2005, 3 or 4 times a year, pathologists from 8 different clinical sites from around the country and Dr. Kleiner meet in Baltimore to read liver biopsy slides. And they record features of NASH by consensus. And they have read over 5,000 slides since 2005.
We're actually closer to 6,000.
They're close to 6,000. They read about 50 slides a day is the way that I've calculated.
50 cases.
So why have we brought him here for the clinical trials talk? Well, the NASH Clinical Research Network has conducted 2 longitudinal studies and 5 clinical trials in over about 2,500 adults, 1,000 children with histology-based entry criteria, and change in histology on the centrally read slides as the primary outcome in 3 of these trials. Dr. Kleiner's authored over 200 publications. He has a bibliometric H index of 75. So what does that mean? Well, that's why I had no idea. I'm like, is that good? So I looked it up. And so Wikipedia says 20 is good.
20? Okay.
40 is better. 60 is truly exceptional. And you are at 75, so you're beyond exceptional. His publication, Design and Validation of a Histological Scoring System for NASH, is one of the most widely cited methods papers in liver literature with over 5,000 citations. So please help me welcome Dr. David Kleiner. All right, David, I know you're loud,
Yes.
but
Yeah,
just
but
for the-
now I can be louder. All right,
there,
let me stick this somewhere.
you got, these actually work.
Okay,
So I'm gonna put them here.
so is that close enough?
Everybody-
Casting. Everyone can hear me, right?
Okay.
Okay. All right. So, so I know that this is kind of a mixed audience, and some of you may not have, I'm not exactly sure what the pathways are to get to the School of Public Health. I'm sure some of them some people go through medical school, maybe some people just come up through graduate school and get PhDs. And you may or may not know anything about liver disease. So I thought before I got into some of the analyses that we've done with the School of Public Health here, I would tell you a little bit about liver disease and about pathology in general, and how it sometimes gets involved in clinical trials and endpoints. And being at the well, let me just go on here. So I don't have any financial or other kinds of conflicts of interest here. I didn't know if this was a lecture that would be CME or not, so I just threw that in. But this is kind of the way that I have experienced life over the years. I don't know if you know anything about the National Institutes of Health or the NCI, but there's a research hospital on campus, and we do nothing but natural history studies and clinical trials and other kinds of, and basic science studies that are associated with those things. And any patient who's enrolled there signs a consent, enrolled in a protocol for something. And oftentimes our patients are on 2 or 3 or 4 protocols all at once. And so a lot of my life is spent with one foot over here and one foot over here. And I have learned over the years, especially since I kind of grew up at the NCI, that this is actually kind of an odd situation. And most of my colleagues live entirely over here and only sort of dip their toes over here every so often. But there's a lot of differences in the way that we care for patients in real life versus how we treat them in clinical research settings. So in real life, the clinical workup varies, the information that's available to the pathologist and the pathology workup varies, just depending on the patient and who's seeing the case and all of that. And finally, what we render is a text diagnosis. It's what you could say an analog diagnosis and a comment. It may be structured differently for different situations, or even in the same diagnosis, different pathologists may word something differently. They may mean, they may say the same words and mean slightly different things, or they may say different words and mean the same thing. It's, that's real life. And on the clinical research side, though, for pathology, though, you try and have the same workup every single time, and this is what I have tried to do in sort of my own practice, if you will. We're blinded to the clinical evaluation, which is not always the case for me, but I can make myself blind if I want to, and so we try and work up the case and evaluate it the same way every single time. And I have the advantage of seeing all of the liver biopsies that come through the NCI. So if you look at my reports, one to another, they look exactly the same. I say things always the same way. I always read them out the same way. If I have to do scores, they're done the same way. So that, in that sense, my clinical stuff actually lives over here a lot. And so that's, if you're dealing with pathologists, one of the things that you have to remember is that most of the time they're living over here, and they may or may not be comfortable working over here. So the other problem is this. So this is a photomicrograph of fatty liver disease, and I'll talk a lot about, I'm going to teach you a little bit about what we do and what fatty liver disease is pathologically. And what we do with this. But obviously, it's difficult to take this and do anything with it analytically. Now, we're getting better at image analysis and those sorts of techniques, but there's a ways yet to go with turning this and digitizing it as it is. And so, when we're looking through a microscope, we have to come up with metrics that, give information about this that is significant. But you can see that if you take this and turn it into that, 5 numbers, and actually most clinical trials these days, they'll leave out this middle one here, this score in the middle, and they'll just have these 4. And then furthermore, they'll take this one and this one and this one, and they'll add it together, for this case be 5, and fibrosis 2, and 2 numbers will be all that they use. All of the information that they get out of this biopsy is boiled down to 2 numbers. And not only that, but then they'll dichotomize it and they'll say everything above this number is one category and everything below that number is another category, because it's too hard to deal with a continuous scale. Okay, so this frustrates me no end, but there's nothing I can do about it. And we have to live in this world where we have to boil this beautiful pathology down to a handful of numbers. The other thing I wanted to introduce to you, and you've probably heard these terms before, but coming from a pathologist's point of view. So the goals of staging and grading systems. So you can use staging and grading. It's all across medicine and surgery. We use these terms. Use them for all kinds of purposes. You can use them for stratification, for treatment or protocol entry. You want disease of a certain stage or severity, which is grade. You might use them for prognostication. you can also use them for structured pathology data collection, which is, so one of the things that we do, and we're going to do once we're done with this little talk here, is go back and score biopsies and collect that kind of information. So there's all kinds of things that people do with these terms, but what they are is sometimes a little obscure. So stage, think of that as the stratification of the level of progress of a disease to its final endpoint. You always start at stage 0, that's no disease, and then stage whatever at the other end, that's the end stage. And you can think about this in terms of cancer. So stage 0 cancer is usually where it still has not invaded, and stage 4, it's out of the box everywhere in the body. Grade, though, is different. It's the stratification of the severity of the disease at a particular point in time. Okay, so how bad is it today? And then scoring is another term that I think you can distinguish from these two, and that's the process of creating these numbers, right? I showed you the picture and I turned it into numbers. That's what scoring is. And it's usually possible for a therapeutic intervention to affect the grade, but not always the stage. So they mean different things and they respond differently. Now, I'm hoping that this is a somewhat mathematical audience, and I think that's true. And this is the mental model that I've used for a long time. So you have a graph here, time at the bottom, loss of function measured in some way up the y-axis, and then a curve which describes the patient's progress from the onset of the disease till they die. And I've got cirrhosis over here as a marker for liver disease, but you could put anything in there that signifies an important clinical endpoint that's on this pathway. And so the grade is the tangent to this curve at any one point. It's the first derivative. And then the stage would be where you are along the y-axis. I find, though, that my colleagues, and especially my clinical colleagues, have a hard time taking that sort of abstract mathematical concept and turning it into some understanding. So I came up with this way of talking about it, and that's talking about this in terms of a road trip. So grade is how fast am I going, and stage is how far have I come. And so in liver disease, in the fatty liver disease we're going to talk about, grade is these kinds of things. How much fat there is, steatosis, how much inflammation there is, this feature of ballooning, which I'll get into. We can use these composite scores that we've come up with. But stage in liver disease is basically how much fibrosis is there. And that's a really good histologic marker of this progress from normal to end stage. And there are a couple of results out of this. One is that how far I've traveled is likely to be a stronger predictor of when I'm going to arrive at my destination than how fast I'm traveling at any point in time. Because we all know traffic can be terrible, and you might get held up somewhere. But if I'm traveling from DC to San Francisco, if I'm out here in Utah as opposed to over here in Pennsylvania, well, I'm much more likely to get to San Francisco first, no matter how fast I'm traveling, and cars only go certain speeds anyway. So that's an important thing to remember when you're looking at analyses of stage and grade, and stage comes out as more important. It always does. And sometimes grade is important for long-term outcomes too, but not always. Okay, so in liver disease, fibrosis is a surrogate measurement of the progress of the liver disease to cirrhosis, which in itself is a surrogate measurement that marks a point that's close to end stage organ failure. And so we have increasing fibrosis here, and then we can come up with other kinds of activity measures, which are these other things. So now a brief histology lesson so that you're a little bit oriented. So this is normal liver. There's a portal area here and central veins here, and these are all hepatocytes in between. And so the portal area is where the blood vessels come into the liver and distribute the blood. So you have a portal vein and an artery, and the bile goes out. So there's a bile duct right there in the middle. And then the blood percolates through this parenchyma and eventually dumps into these veins here. And And so liver has a very simple structure to it. So here it is a little bit closer. You have a portal area here and a portal area here, and the duct and the artery and the vein. So blood in, bile out, and I don't have a vein here, but there's one on this, and then it all dumps, the blood dumps into this, and then goes up to the heart. This is a Masson stain. I'm going to show you some Masson stains. I just wanted to explain this first. So you have the blue. This is a three dye stain. So the blue here stains collagen, and this is the stain that we most often use to look for fibrosis, right? And we can pretty reasonably, stage liver biopsy using just this one stain. And then the hepatocytes are sort of this dark red color, and the nuclei of the cells are purple. So this is the histologic spectrum of NAFLD. So when we're looking at these biopsies, we're trying to put the diagnosis into one of these boxes. Again, this is a research activity, right? In real life, we're not limited to boxes. We can cross the boxes. We can put in other words. But when you're trying to collect data for a clinical trial, you have to put things in boxes. So what I'm going to spend most of the time here is talking about this particular box, steatohepatitis. But there are milder forms of the disease that just have steatosis and inflammation. We might not see anything on the biopsy. So it might not even show fatty liver disease. There's this pattern here, which is more seen in young children, and I'm not going to go into that. And then at the very end, you might have such damage to the liver that you can no longer even tell that it was fatty liver disease to begin with. And that's sometimes given the name of cryptogenic cirrhosis. But I want to talk about this mainly. So steatohepatitis, or non-alcoholic steatohepatitis, was a name given to this disease by a group at Mayo Clinic back in 1980. It's not that we didn't know about this disease before, we did. You can find publications back into the 50s at least that show this kind of change. But what Ludwig did was he gave it a name, and naming things is important. And so in this case, it was a recognition that this looked just like alcoholic liver disease, but in patients who swore that they never drank. And so this was odd. And so they published this, and at the time it was a bit of an oddity and nobody paid attention to it. And there were a few publications along the way, and then eventually it caught on. And now that we've cured hepatitis C and we can control hepatitis B, this is the big new problem on the horizon. So one of the things about steatohepatitis is that it's a very specific pattern of injury. And what I mean by that is I can look through the microscope, I can see these changes, and bam, recognize this as steatohepatitis. And I can do that in the presence of other liver diseases. So even if there's hepatitis C there, I can say, oh, there's hepatitis C, but the patient also has steatohepatitis. And the characteristics are this has got fat, steatosis, and inflammation. Those are required. They're part of the name, but it's not sufficient. And then this injury here, which I'll show you, particularly this ballooning degeneration, and then there can be fibrosis. But remember, fibrosis is stage, right? So it's an outcome usually, not necessarily a cause. So here's a biopsy, and over here's the portal area, here's the central vein, and what you can see is that there's the fat and these funny cells, which are the balloon cells, and probably some inflammation. We can't see at this magnification. And that's happening around the central vein. And that's the zone 3 area. Zone 1 is over here. Zone 2 is in the middle. So zone 3 centered injury. This is another lower power shot. So the portal area is right in the middle here. And there's all of this action happening out here. This is where the central veins run. And sometimes zone 3 comes right up to the edge of the portal area. But this part looks good. So this is still zone 3. But lots of fat. Fat turns out to be, it dissolves when we process the specimen. So it looks clear under the microscope. And here's another one. This one isn't quite so clear. Here's the portal area, and it's hard to see the vein. But if you do a Masson stain, what you can see is that that the blue, all of the extra blue stuff is over here. This is all abnormal. You see these strands of collagen running in between the cells like this, and that's all around the central vein. And here's the portal area, and everything looks fine actually around the portal area. So ballooning, this turns out to be a fairly critical thing. And again, it's a microscopic appearance. So the cell, you have these enlarged cells. They're much bigger than the surrounding hepatocytes. The cytoplasm looks funny. It's got clumpy areas, and it's got areas that are cleared, and some have this sort of flocculent material in them. I mean, you might see you might see inclusions that we call Mallory bodies, and those are these red, ropey things that often hug the nucleus. And so here's one that's blown up really big. So you see this cell. This one is only 87 microns. So they're very small, even so. So normal hepatocytes around 20, 25 microns or so. But the balloon cells are usually much bigger. Here's another one. You can see how stranded this stuff is. And when I show nice examples like this, everybody can agree, yes, those in fact are balloon cells. We don't have a problem with that. Here's another one. Big fat Mallory bodies. This is inflammation. So all these little blue nuclei here are lymphocytes and macrophages. And so we have ways of scoring that as well. But one of the concepts that we ran into that I'm going to talk about in a little more detail later is that we have balloon cells that we can easily recognize and we have no problem with, and then we have funny changes in cytoplasm in smaller cells that we argue about. And so the thing to do was to stop arguing about those things and give them a name. So we call them non-classical ballooning, and they're typically in the same place that you find the other balloon cells, but they're smaller. Sometimes they travel in groups. But they have kind of the same cytoplasmic alterations, but you can look for them, but you won't find these Mallory body inclusions. And we also came up with this idea here of looking at severe ballooning. So when you put the slide under the microscope, you're at low magnification, and they just pop out of the background, these huge balloon cells. And there are usually multiple of them across the biopsy. Inflammatory changes, so you get these little foci of lobular inflammation here in the background, little collections of lymphocytes and macrophages. Sometimes you get little pockets of neutrophils. So again, this is a very characteristic injury type for chronic liver disease in general. And most of the scoring systems that people have come up with have looked at the numbers of these foci of lobular inflammation in a certain magnification or a certain area of the biopsy. And the other thing is there's portal inflammation. So those portal areas that had the nice vein and artery coming in and the bile duct going out, they can become filled with inflammatory cells, and sometimes the cells spill out of the portal area into this, what we call interface hepatitis. And then finally, the fibrosis pattern. So we have ways of looking at the fibrosis pattern, and it's very distinctive in steatohepatitis. So you have a vein here, portal area over here, and this network of fibrosis that kind of encircles cells. Most other chronic liver diseases don't do this. They make wide bands of fibrosis or narrow bands of fibrosis, but they don't have this sort of spidery extension out into the hepatocytes like this. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about staging and grading, because you won't understand anything else I talk about unless I turn these pictures into numbers, right? So there are a bunch of grading and staging systems out there. I'm only going to tell you about ours, because these don't matter anymore. No. Beth Brunt was one of our group, and actually this system that has my name at the beginning of it is really an intellectual descendant of Beth's system. And then my good friend Pierre Vidosa in France wanted to modify these stage scoring systems a little bit, make them simpler. So he came up with this system. I'm sure this one works fine. We don't use it here though, because it's French and. So this was the scoring system, and what happened was at the beginning of the clinical trials, this is back now in actually 2003 or thereabouts, the steering committee, Beth and I were the pathologists who would come to the steering committee meetings, and the steering committee said to us, we need the pathologists to get together to come up with a way to record things about these biopsies that will allow us to track them in time and measure change and use them as outcomes in our clinical trials. So we all met at the NIH at that time, and actually some of the original members are still here. They've hung on for all of these years. And we sat around and we looked at some cases, and then we free associated about things that we thought could be easy to look at and record, that was simple, so you only needed 2 slides to do it on, and we wanted to keep things sort of cheap and simple because we knew that, first of all, we'd be looking at a lot of cases, and second, we didn't want to burden the study with lots of extra stuff. So we categorized things in, the fat accumulation. Of course, fibrosis was very important, how much inflammation there was and what kind it was. This hepatocellular injury, which includes ballooning and other things, and then some other things that we just thought would be interesting to follow. And it was mainly designed as a research tool. And sometimes people ask me, well, should I use this everyday practice? Well, maybe, but only if there's a good understanding between you and your clinician about what these things mean and what to do. So for steatosis, again, this is all very simple. It's crude. It's right through the microscope. We just gestalt it out. So we look at the involvement of the parenchyma by fat. So you look at low magnification at how many vacuoles you see. And if it looks like they're less than 5% of the parenchyma, it's 0. And then by thirds up through there. It's like mindlessly simple. And then we looked at where it was. So is it in zone 3 or zone 1, or is it spread out all over, or we can't tell. This was our wastebasket category. And inflammation, similarly, very simple. We thought lobular inflammation was probably more important, and so we paid more attention to it, and we actually wrote, well, if we see less than 2 foci in a 20x field on average, or 2 to 4, or more than 4, we would score that, 0 to 3. And portal inflammation, we were a lot more vague. It was just none or mild or more than mild. But it turns out that portal inflammation is actually important. This is just data from a study that we published a while ago where we looked at the amount of portal inflammation across all of these different stages, and it was definitely true that portal inflammation tends to accumulate and becomes much worse towards the higher stages. So as you get up to stage 4 cirrhosis or bridging fibrosis just before it, or even this intermediate stage here of 2, it gets pretty significant. And then there's the ballooning, which we were also, this was a difficult one because we wanted it to be simple and reproducible. So we didn't see any, or they were not many, or they were small, or whether there were lots. And then Mallory bodies, these inclusions, the same way, sort of none to rare and then many. And this was the diagram we published in that first description paper of the scoring system. So none here, easily many over here, and this was something that fell in between from a case that we all scored as a 1. Now it turns out that of all of the characteristics that I showed you, when you look at it in univariate analysis, what comes out as important in long-term outcome of the things that might be grayed turns out to be portal inflammation and ballooning, at least in this study this was not a NASH CRN study, this was one I did with Paul Angelo, who's a hepatologist who unfortunately died a few years ago. But it was an international study, retrospective, and they were interested in this. So bad portal inflammation, even back at time 0, was worse than having more, and in the same way with ballooning, sort of stratified into these different groups, and this was significant. So fibrosis, this was our staging system, again, very simple, and there's actually fairly dramatic change between these different stages. I mean, cirrhosis can be very bad, this can be very subtle, and these are obviously in between. We broke down stage 1 into these sub-stages here, mainly because the children seem to have this 1C pattern, but most adults are up here in 1A or 1B. So here are those sub-stages. So 1A is barely perceptible, and then 1B was a little bit thicker, and then the 1C was fibrosis around the portal areas, but nothing out around the veins. And fibrosis, being stage, right, stratifies the outcome pretty well. And actually, fibrosis in this study trumped out all of the other variables. So we put all of the grade components and stage in the model, and all of the grade components fell out, and only stage remained. And this was actually more important than some of the clinical characteristics as well. So when we first started all of this, I told the steering committee that I did not want them to add up these numbers. But that was not to be. And in order to keep the sizes of the different arms in clinical trials down, we ended up having to add together scores. And so we came up with this NAFLD activity score, which was based on the results of a multivariable analysis to see what characteristics matched with our diagnosis of steatohepatitis. And what fell out were steatosis, lobular inflammation, ballooning, and fibrosis. But we excluded fibrosis to avoid mixing stage with grade. So this was our activity score, and people then turned it into a diagnosis, which irritated us all. So we wrote a paper, and because that's what you do when you're irritated about stuff. And so what it does is that the score, this NAS score, has a different meaning from the diagnosis. So both of them are individually related to, say, aminotransferases, which is the enzyme that's most often used to look for hepatocellular injury in the liver. But when you put them both in the model, really the score comes out as being a little bit stronger than the diagnosis. But if you're looking at diabetes, then again, well, not again, but only the diagnosis is really significantly associated with the diagnosis. And if you put both of them in the model, the NAS score is actually quite clearly not related to the diagnosis. So they have different meanings. We were seeing different things by making the diagnosis than by scoring, and so they're both important. These were our agreement statistics from that first study. This is our inter-rater kappa. I could tell you that from other studies in other liver diseases that lobular inflammation is always our worst. Although these were the best scores we had across the group for the inter-rater kappa, and Michael Torbenson, I think, was this one here, was just really, really good at his own reproducibility. So what can I say? And we've also done this with our group scoring. So after this, we go back, we'll look through a multi-headed microscope, and we'll score things. And the weighted kappas come out about the same for these characteristics as they did in that original study. So I mean, there are limits to the amount of reproducibility you could get in an observational study, but this is actually pretty good. And you can work with this. It does introduce some noise into the system, but in clinical trial sizes of the usual sort, this is very doable. We can deal with these things. So there are some advantages to using this system and some limitations, as there are with anything, and it's important to be aware of them. One of the things was that there was imbalance between these characteristics and ballooning, and these are probably less important in the long run than the ballooning is, and so that was unfortunate. This only gets 2 points, and each of those get 3. So it was pretty detailed system, so most people trim it down to just a few things. So some things about the natural history and how we've used these scores to understand what the natural history might be. So when I showed you that original diagram of stage and time, it looked like it was a nice scale that you could do things with. Well, it turns out fibrosis in this system could have a fairly complex progression pathway, and so you could imagine lots of different pathways to go from here to here. You could go by this periportal pathway down here, which probably is not used very often, or you could come up this way. You could go directly to stage 2 from here, or you could go directly to stage 3. Again, most patients seem to go that way, but probably a few go this way along that outer top. That's complicated. But what we did, and this is a study that's currently under review. So all of this data here is not published yet, but this is a study from our adults, 2 or more biopsies, where we looked at the first and last biopsies that were at least a year apart, and the time period didn't include one of the treatment arms from our clinical trials. And so, so to begin with, we had 3,400 odd biopsies, and then we took out some because they were in the treatment trials or they were these other things, which left us with 2,800, and then we took out the ones that only had one biopsy, because obviously you couldn't use those. So that left us 474 patients with multiple biopsies. We took out some of the patients, since we were only going to deal with patients who had fatty liver disease. We took out 14 cases that didn't have that feature on the first biopsy, and then 14 other pairs that were less than a year apart. And so that left us with 446 pairs that we could look at for histologic data. And then once we narrowed it down to those that had clinical data, so the enzymes and the diabetic markers and all the other things that people felt were important clinically, we're down to 219. So from 3,400 to 219, kind of sad, but you deal with what you can. So these were a couple of figures to show disease worsening. So you have up here, you have a Masson stain and an H&E stain of the first biopsy, and you can see there's just a little bit of blue there, and it looks quite fatty, but there weren't that many balloon cells, if any at all, here. And then the second biopsy, less fat, but lots of balloon cells and much more fibrosis. So there's been significant progression of disease between these two biopsies. But we also had a fair number that got better. So this was a case that had that dramatic ballooning to begin with and lots of fibrosis. And at the end, really didn't have much of anything, just a little steatosis. And it's hard to explain this, but this actually looks resolving to us. If you look through the microscope, there's not much inflammation here, and it looks like it's resorbing rather than being produced. So things were going back and forth. And so I show this just to explain the graph or the table you're going to see in the next slide. So the things down here in this green trial, those patients got better, lower stage, and the pink or orangey pink, it never comes out right. Up here, those patients got worse, and so this is how the if you just look at the histology changes, you got 446. So we had a lot of patients who got better on the second biopsy, and then some who got worse as well. And if you look at the diagnosis, so here's our categories. So fatty liver disease that wasn't steatohepatitis. We have a borderline category for things in between, and then definite. And then, so these got worse. These got better. There's a lot of people who started out with definite that we could not make that diagnosis on the second biopsy. And of course, all of this is done blinded. We don't know anything about these cases. So then we looked at what kinds of things, clinical and histologic factors, might be important in understanding this. So you see, so looking at clinical and histologic things at baseline, and then changes of enzymes, ALT or AST or LDL, low density lipoprotein, from the time of the first biopsy to the second. You can see that there are some things that make a difference. So starting out for fibrosis regression, the lower your AST is to begin with, the better off you are. But also for progression, the same thing in reverse. So if you're progressing A higher value is more significant. But many other things did not pan out, especially for progression. More things predicted regression. So low HOMA-IR, this is a measure of insulin resistance, less portal inflammation, and actually a higher fibrosis stage, because it's one of those funny things when you have a limited thing, you tend to have people improve who are worse to begin with. And then this was, if you just take out if you look at just the histologic things at baseline or the change, what you can see, dropping out the clinical characteristics, ballooning either predicted regression or progression depending on how bad it was. Same with portal inflammation and fibrosis stage. And then the change of these things was also important, very important. Steatosis grade was important only in the downward direction, but ballooning was important, and portal inflammation was important in both. And then if we used the NAS, we could show that kind of the same things. It was only useful in the progression direction, not in the regression direction, but the change was significant in both directions. And so I think this is a little bit easier to see. So what you want to see is less of this on the second bar and more of this, right? So if you see in the where the diagnosis improved, a lot of people had less fibrosis on that second biopsy. So it all goes together. Whereas if there's no change, actually, except for this first category where there was some improvement from the first biopsy to the second, most of these actually, the bars at the top get bigger. So staying the same, having the same diagnosis in the first and last biopsy is not a good thing. So maintaining status quo is not what you want. You want to actually change the diagnosis. And of course, if the diagnosis gets worse, well, if you go from NAFLD to NASH, you know, a lot more of the higher stages, borderline to NASH, again, a lot more of the higher stages. If you just go between these two lower categories, NAFLD to borderline, even that little change, there was a difference in how much fibrosis there was. All of these, the stage got worse. And if you plot the change in that composite score, the NAS, against the change in fibrosis, it actually came out better than I thought. You know, and if you'd asked me if I would see this 13 years ago, I would have said, this is all meaningless, you know, adding these things together. And yet, maybe we didn't make such bad choices after all. And the importance of this is that the change in this number here, this composite number, is often used as a clinical endpoint, right? And what people want to know, though, is does it make a difference to the patient, which is this over here? Does it change the stage? And what you see is that, you know, from 0 on up, so if you don't change that score, if the composite score remains the same or increases, you're either, you know, sort of right at no change in the fibrosis, or you definitely get worse. But as soon as you sort of dip below, you start to see that, you know, the bars don't cross 0 anymore. There's a lot of noise out here at the end, but you can pay attention to these here. You know, most of the patients start to look like they're getting better. And that's a difference that regulators start to pay attention to. So no one will take this as a hard endpoint, but they will take a change in fibrosis stage as a hard endpoint. So over 4 years, this is just a natural history cohort. They just got standard of care advice. They just saw their doctor every year, and they told them lose weight and take care of yourself better. We had a lot of people just get better on their own. And so when you take the histological and clinical data and you link it with changes in the aminotransferases, you can get a decent model to predict progression and regression. And improvement or worsening can also be used as clinical endpoints, and that was important. So hopefully somebody will accept that paper for publication. So the other thing, I have some time here. I want to talk a little bit more about this ballooning thing and this problem of steatosis accounting for more weight. So there are two solutions. You can either drop the steatosis from the score, which is the solution that Pierre Bedossa came up with. So in France, they dropped the steatosis from the score, and there were other modifications as well, but that was the big change. And so his activity scale is just lobular inflammation and ballooning, or you can extend the ballooning scale. And so we looked into doing that. So we had these three ways of looking at the biopsy. You could see if the balloon cells looked non-classical or classical. Were they easy to tell? Could I publish a picture of that and say, yeah, that's ballooning? Or would I have a really hard time convincing my colleagues, yeah, there's really ballooning there, so that's the difference there. Or was it severe? So as we did this, what we just paying attention to the way that we scored things, we have this zero or none, few, many scoring system, but if there was only non-classical ballooning, it tended to be scored as few, even if we saw lots of them. That if we saw any classical ballooning at all, we didn't call it non-classical, we only called it classical. And then the severe ballooning was always many, was scored as many, or 2+, and classical. So what we did was we put this together into a new scoring system. So if 0 was 0, if there was non-classical ballooning, so not classical, and either a few or many, that got a 1. And then if it was classical but few, we gave it a 2. Classical and many, 3, and then severe got a 4. And so simple conversion, nonlinear, of these characteristics turned into a score it's now 0 to 4. So it reduces the diagnostic or weight that the non-classical balloonings have in the system, gives more weight to ballooning overall if we use this system, and it's a better correlation with the diagnosis, which I'll show you in a graph in a bit. So we again pulled all the data, we looked at the clinical data along with it, and so this was how many cases we had. So we had a lot of cases because this was all cross-sectional study, and they fell into these categories. And I'm sorry, this is actually the data from my presentation at AASLD, so it's actually fewer cases than we have in the paper, the manuscript that's under writing right now. So we had 1,250 almost cases there, and then almost all of them had lab data too, which was nice. So these were, if you just compare groups against each other, honestly, I didn't think the non-classical, we weren't quite sure if that was going to turn into anything or not, but it turns out that those patients with non-classical ballooning actually have more severe histology, more steatosis, more lobular inflammation, more portal inflammation, and more fibrosis than the patients who didn't have any ballooning. And they also had more metabolic syndrome. So there were some other differences too, which aren't as striking. Then there was a big jump once we got to these classical balloon cells. So you compare those against the non-classical ones. Still more histologic injury, but also more women in that group. The women tend to have more severe disease than men for reasons that aren't quite clear to me. Diabetes, more diabetes, higher ALTs, higher more abnormal glucose, and more diabetic changes biochemically. And the same way with the severe, there was yet another step up. So there was a good relationship to our diagnosis. So if we saw classical ballooning, we tended to call it definite steatohepatitis, and that was nice. And then this was strongly associated with fibrosis, right? So there's our stage, and this was, with the severity of the ballooning in a cross-sectional way, there was good correlation with increasing stage, such that patients with severe ballooning basically always had fibrosis. I don't think we had any without it. This is the relationships to age and sex. So it's more women in these higher categories, and the age also increased a little bit over the group. So older patients tend to have worse disease as well. And then this is with diabetes and metabolic syndrome. So you can see kind of the steady increase in the number of diabetics in these groups as we go up the scale. And the big step up in metabolic syndrome when most of our patients have metabolic syndrome. So we went from 65% to 80%, and then it flattened out after that. But this to me was what told me that we probably were looking at something real with that non-classical ballooning. And then the HOMA-IR, this is the insulin resistance measure. So there was a big jump between few classical balloons and having many classical balloons. And then basically these three were within error the same, and the same way with these two. So there was a big jump right there. And finally the enzymes, so ALT, transaminases, the main liver enzyme for hepatocellular injury, went up, and alkaline phosphatase also went up, again, for reasons that aren't quite clear, except that maybe there's just more liver injury. So basically, what we're trying to do is propose a new ballooning score that's based on morphology that better stratifies this ballooning, which does seem to be one of the more important things that we recognize under the microscope. And it doubles the dynamic range of the current score, shows good correlation with clinical features and patient demographics. And we may, if this catches on and this score gets incorporated into activity scores, it allows changes in ballooning to play a larger role. And I think particularly if you're doing clinical trials with diabetics, because we tend to see these really severe ballooning more in the diabetics than not. So in those kind of clinical trials, it probably will make more of a difference. And so, just to finish up here, so steatohepatitis is a specific pattern of injury. It's mainly characterized by ballooning, and that we have developed these scoring systems that can translate that complicated visual information into a few numbers that actually seem to mean something, both in terms of stage and grade. So we can say how bad it is today, and we can say how far the patient has gone. And then what you can use these systems is for all of these natural history studies and for clinical trials. And the reason why this system caught on, I think, is because it is simple, it's easy to apply, and people have found it effective for using in their clinical trials. And so, the other thing is it was the right place, the right time, which is always true with things that catch on. It was just, the world was ripe for this sort of thing. And we just happened to be out there putting our toe in the water first. So I could not do this without a lot of other people, and I never want to claim any of this as my own work personally. Obviously, I played a role with the pathology group, but there are a lot of other really brilliant people that I get to work with, and then all of the adult investigators are in white, and the pediatric investigators are in this sort of orangey color, and the people at the DCC, without whom these analyses would not happen, and our sponsorship by the NIPDK. And so that's it. Thank you very much.
So we have about 10 minutes, so if there's any questions for our speaker.
Yes?
Janet?
Well, first, thank you that as a person who's not a medical doctor, that I understood it all. It was really good.
Good.
Or at least I think I did.
All right.
So my question was for the new ballooning score.
Mm-hmm.
Did you base the development of that score on a different set of slides and pathology than
Mm-hmm.
what you based its association on with disease? Were those different databases independent?
Let me see if I understand your question. So, did we come up with a score and then apply it to a different set of things? Or did we? No, probably not. So it has not been used in a completely separate set of cases. So we came up with this score as a is a way of extending the scale. And we didn't actually come up with the score to begin with. We came up with these categories of non-classical, classical, severe, not severe. And then just started reviewing cases as we had always done. So the definitions were there, and then we prospectively reviewed more cases. and again, all of this happens in the vacuum of looking at the pathology without any of the clinical information. And then to understand if any of it meant anything, we looked at how these different characteristics related to one another, and the extended scale kind of fell right out of that. I mean, it was very clear. There were no cases, for instance, that were severe that we called few. It just didn't happen. So they're all related very tightly. And then we took that, and on the cases that we had prospectively reviewed, we looked to see what the clinical data looked like, and that's how it was. So we have not gone back to yet either a completely independent set of cases from another institution to look at those, or back to necessarily to cases that we scored previously, during the first 5 or 6 years of the study, to sort of rescore those and see how they matched, if they matched in the same way to the clinical data acquired early as the later cases did. There are certain amounts of, there are sort of time limitations, and we only gather as a group for a certain period of time. So we're a little limited in the number of options that we have for that kind of validation. So that hasn't been done yet, but maybe some other group will take it up. The other things have been validated. I mean, people not part of the NASH CRN have taken our scoring system and have used it to score their cases and have come up with the same kinds of associations and used it in clinical trial situations, again, outside the NASH CRN, and have gotten success with it. So, yeah.
I have a question.
Sure.
How did you assign weights to different components of your
That's an excellent question. I didn't show you this because I didn't want to get into the whole history of scoring systems, but the grandfather or grandmother of scoring systems in pathology is one that called the Nodal system for chronic hepatitis. And that was created actually mainly at the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology, which was down at Walter Reed, and is no more. It has transmogrified into something else, but it had a very good liver pathology group, and they came up with this system. I think it was published in 1980, and it was a weighted scoring system, and so it went from on a 0 to 4 scale, it was actually 0, 1, 3, 4, because they felt that the more severe features deserved more weight, and that's a perfectly reasonable thing to do. In pathology, especially with the staging system, we should probably be weighting those things on a quadratic scale rather than a linear scale. But having those gaps in the integer sequence makes people really uncomfortable. They really wanted to have a 2. It's hard to remember, yes. So every system that's come after that has always had successively more severe features, just 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. And sometimes that makes sense, and sometimes it doesn't. And people use them in all kinds of, really you probably shouldn't be treating them mathematically the same way that you treat other things, but people do, and it all works out. And, it's hard to do anything else, because these are all semi-quantitative, right? They're all scaled, but they're not necessarily proportional, and yet we assign these numbers to them, and it's a little arbitrary, but until we have better tools, and they're coming along, where you can take that picture and you can turn it into a more continuous scale, right? From 0 to 100% with decimal points and everything, and until we're there, until you can shove a slide in a slot and have it read out steatosis this and inflammation that and any other characteristic you want. Until we get to that point, these are the tools that we have that are easiest to use, and any pathologist can apply them. So, yeah, it's unfortunate but true. It's one of the realities of my
So
work.
David, when you're trying to score these labs with a consensus group,
Mm-hmm.
how many times is there
disagreement.
Consensus, and how many times is there?
Well,
disagreement?
usually I have to beat down my colleagues and sprout, no. Most of the time, you know, we come to consensus pretty quickly. There are cases that we'll struggle with, and sometimes it's it's classification, putting it in one of those diagnostic buckets that we have, because the features don't quite fall into one of the patterns clearly, right? And when that happens, then there's room for variability and some of the noise that comes into the observational differences. What I've often fantasized about is that I think that there is value in that noise, how well you agree or disagree over something. And you know, if we're stuck between cirrhosis and bridging fibrosis, so stage 3 and stage 4, and half think it's 3 and half think it's 4, well, that's meaningful. If we saw the biopsy and everybody thought 4, you know, all cirrhosis, that's probably worse than the ones we disagree about, right? Or the ones that we agree are just bridging. But there's no way to really capture that information. And, but, you know, it's potentially there. We just don't record it.
So you want a 0.5?
Yeah, well, you know, I mean, you almost could. The other thing I should say about pathology staging and grading systems is that all of them break down. You look at people's reports, pathology reports, and you will see things like stage 1 to 2 all the time, or grade 1 to 2, or 3 to 4, or whatever it is. There's always the pathologist out there who cannot make that decision and say. And so what happens in the end is most of the time, these scoring systems, which may have been 2 or 3 or 4 or 5, they break them down into sort of low grade, high grade, right? And then of course, there'll always be the case where you'll say low to high grade. It doesn't matter. But you know, it's the same sort of thing. And you know, you want to have that continuous scale, but you have these discrete boxes that you can put things in, and because that's what computers understand.
And it's sort of a group dynamic too that's sort of changed over the last 16 years. I think
Yeah.
we started out one way and it kind of
Yeah,
morphed
there's,
along as it went.
you know, I think if we went back to the first couple hundred cases that we scored, we would probably be a bit different now than we were then. But I think it's more because of our understanding of the pathology is better, you know, and so we're a little more clear on definitions and stuff like that.
We used to fight a lot about the ballooning score of those kind of borderline cases, and then this new system, everybody, I think, is a lot, at least I'm a lot happier
Yeah.
with it
Yeah.
than I was with
Yeah,
calling everything a balloon. So.
right. So, anyway.
Okay, so let's all thank our speaker again for a great talk.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for the invitation.
Well, I wish I'd heard that 5 years ago, or 15 years ago. That would have helped.
Yeah.
Well, let me just stop this recording. And
Okay.
then,
Now, let me take off
take that
the
off.
price.
Yeah.